Good morning. Welcome back. Welcome to Divided, week 12. So if you haven't been here for a couple months, you didn't miss anything because we haven't met for a while. Week 12, this week we're going to be breaking down congregational churches. Anybody know of or seen or been to or heard of a congregational church by denomination? Yeah? Where? Here? Somewhere else?
Yeah, around.
Okay. There's one up on 31 between Elgin and Dundee. That big, beautiful church on top of the hill is a congregational church, I believe. That's the only one I can think of, okay? And there's a reason, and we're going to find out why. But before we start talking about congregational churches, I want to just remind us, especially having been not met for a while, why are we doing this? Why are we talking about these things? Honestly, the goal, and I was thinking more about this, especially as we got into actually breaking down the different denominations, that the goal is not just really to say, okay, what's the difference? I want to talk about those things. I want to get those things out there, and sometimes that's going to be easier than others, but that's not the only purpose. These are the purposes. The first reason is deeper appreciation for church history and denominations. Just something that our generation needs, a deeper appreciation for history, a deeper understanding of where we've been so that we have more wisdom and more knowledge about where we're going. And likewise, denominations. Most of us are pretty out of the loop when it comes to what's the difference. And honestly, there are things where when I was younger, I would say, doesn't everybody believe this? And then you get into it and you realize, wow, actually the majority don't believe this. So just having awareness of things like that. Deeper appreciation for the truths of God's word, obviously. Knowing that all the doctrinal differences that we're talking about, that's where we're going to find our answers. Number 3 and 4, greater ability to distinguish what's essential and what's not. Things that we must agree on, things that we should agree on, and things that nothing's unimportant, but that we don't have to agree on in order to be able to do church together. And all that is going to be connected to with how clear is God's word about these things. Just a quick recap. In week 10, which was 2 sessions ago, we talked about basically how following kind of the failed Reformation of the Anglican Church, tens of thousands of Puritans and other religious pioneers over a period of about a century, sick of popes and kings and governmental overreach and turmoil and unreformable church institutions. They just get tired of it all, and they travel to America to enjoy religious freedom. They settle in different places, and they begin practicing their faith the way that they believe they should practice their faith. It's a fairly new phenomenon in church history, in Christian history. We haven't really seen people operating with that kind of freedom, even in Christianity, like ever. There's always been sort of a formalized leadership and formalized institution. More specifically, and then last week we talked about Episcopal churches and how they're pretty much Anglican churches in America, and we talked about that last week. You can go back and listen to the session online if you'd like to. More specifically, here's where we've been. If you recall, just back weeks 1 through 8, where we started way back with the church councils and the Great Schism and all the stuff that happened leading up to the Reformation. Then we looked at the Reformation and the different churches, really the main branches of Christianity that came out of the Reformation. The Lutheran Church, obviously, Martin Luther, the Reformed Church, and then the Anglican Church. And then even though these two churches over here, week 7 and 8, Lutheran Church, Reformed churches, even though they came to America too, we kind of used the Anglican Church as our jumping point into American church history because a lot of them, the first ones, were English pioneers, really. And then we talked in week 10 just about the division into denominations, which I just mentioned a second ago. Last week we talked about Episcopal churches, and today we're going to talk about congregational churches. So based on the question that I already asked you, this question may be a little harder to answer, but what ideas or preconceived notions do you have about congregational churches? Do you know anything about them? Have you ever seen one, never been to one? Do you have any preconceived notions at all about them?
All I know about congregational churches is that, like, and I always forget, like, what it's called, but, like, when the church makes a decision, it's, like, the congregation is very heavily involved in making, like, the input into that decision. That's, like, the structure of I forget.
Yeah, governance or polity. Yeah, that's how they function, right? They don't have bishops. They don't, depending on where you look and at what time period, some of them don't even have elders. The congregation decides. Ultimate authority, ultimate decision lies sort of democratic. Everybody gets a vote. That's how they decide things. All church members get a vote. Okay, so that's certainly what they're named for. Okay, anybody else have ideas or preconceived notions about this denomination? Yeah, they are in the minority. Again, there's not a whole lot. And the interesting thing is, as we're going to see this morning, there were a lot back in the day. At one point, they were 33% of American churches, and now they're nowhere near that. So we're going to look at what happened along the way. Okay, so having no preconceived notions should help you see things a little more clearly as we get into it, right? And hopefully you'll learn enough about the congregational churches to be able to answer that question differently next time somebody asks you, which will probably be never. More specifically, here's where we're looking, okay? See Church of England here at the top. We looked at the Episcopal branch last week. We're going to look at the Methodist branch next week. We're going to look at the Baptist branch the following week. And this week, we're going to look at Congregational church, okay, right here, the Congregational dissenters on the side. So again, more specifically, this is the branch we're looking at right here, okay, to the Congregational dissenters. So, like Paula said, congregational churches are sort of founded upon this idea of congregational church governance or congregational church polity, which really insists on two things. One, autonomy, which is basically that every local church, every local congregation of believers totally in control of their own stuff. They make their own decisions. They vote upon everything. There's no outside governing body that tells them what to do or demands anything from them or demands conformity of any kind from them. There's nothing like that, especially in initial congregational churches. So they insist on autonomy. And the second thing is polity, like Paula said. Their leadership really ultimately is that all the members sort of share democratic leadership of the church where everybody's say is equal. Whether you're a person of prominence or a person of not prominence, if you're a church member, ultimately you all wield authority over the church. Okay, and even though congregational churches, like as a denomination, don't really dominate the landscape of American Christianity anymore, the idea of Congregationalism does. The idea of Congregationalism is significantly more churches practice congregational church polity and church governance in America than they do in most places, which kind of makes sense, right? When we know what we know about America, a democracy, a people who some of the very first people ever to land on American soil from the and colonized from Europe were congregational people who instilled not only that value in the church, but that value in society and that value in culture, that there is no king and there is no pope and there is no nothing like that tells all of us what to do. And that mentality is like innate in American culture. So we want to just kind of break down the beginning of the history here of the congregational churches. Even though at the beginning of American history they started out really strong, throughout their history, as you're going to see this morning, tons and tons and tons of disagreements and division that, again, has really drastically changed the landscape of the congregational branch of Christianity. It does not look like it did in the 1600s, 1700s when it first started. And perhaps its most significant contribution to Christianity, to American Christianity, again, is not necessarily the denomination itself so much as the form of church governance. The idea that, again, we all get a vote. We all get a say. We should all have a voice to some degree. There wasn't a whole lot of that in the church up until congregational churches. But if we really want to understand the history, the early history, as well as the composition of the modern day congregational church and all the denominations that come from that branch, we really need to understand where it began. So here's how things began. Okay, if you recall, if you go back to Anglican Church and all the attempts at Reformation, remember all the, this person became the king, queen, and they changed it this way, and then the next person changed it back, and then the next person changed it back, and then the next person changed it back, and there was that crazy cycle in the Anglican Church where reformers got incredibly frustrated. The ones who really felt like change wasn't happening like it needed to happen, it wasn't happening at the speed or to the degree that it needed to happen, became known as the Puritans. They were the people who thought the church needed to be more pure. That was their hope. The church would become more like the New Testament church, like what it was supposed to be. And so they start leaving the Anglican Church And there's a ton of different people leaving at different times for different reasons, and so it's kind of difficult actually to pinpoint like the exact key figures and events that led to the Congregational church, like it is with Luther, where it's like, okay, Luther was the guy, and then he had some guys, and that's how the Lutheran Church came into being. It's not quite the same with Congregational churches. Congregationalism finds its roots in that Puritan separatist movement. Again, that's what they were known as at the time, separatists. Those who said, we're not trying to reform anymore, we're gone. Like, we're not a part of this anymore. They separated. And that was very prominent in the late 1500s, early 1600s. And they decided to leave rather than try and fix it, rather than keep trying to fix it. Okay, I'm not trying to say they just gave up. It was decades of things weren't going anywhere. Which kind of makes sense when you put it in context why Congregationalism found early popularity, doesn't it? You've got popes in still a large portion of the Christian world ruling, dominating. You've got bishops, and now in the Anglican Church, you've got the king or the queen, who is the head of the church, and then you've got the archbishop, and then you've got all these other bishops, and all of these people were just sick and tired of the invasive overreach of these bodies. They were sick of it, and they said, we want to make the decisions for ourselves. This has been abused for so long. It will be better for the church if the church governs itself. That the king doesn't tell me what to believe or how to live, that a pope doesn't tell me how to live or what to believe, that even bishops or some governing body, that nobody does, only we get to decide what's going on in our church. That idea grew incredibly popular, and one of the earliest proponents of Congregationalism was English separatist called Robert Brown. He was one of the first to really, in a courageous step away from the Anglican Church. Again, it took courage to do that. It was not an easy thing to do, to step aside from the church at the time. Your life was in danger if you did that. It wasn't just, I feel like I should. This was a life and death decision to make, to separate from the church. And so what he does is he steps away from the Anglican Church and he forms a new autonomous church in England. And he fairly quickly is arrested and imprisoned for the crime of leaving the church and starting his own church. It was basically considered treason, what he had done. Eventually, he's exiled in 1582. He flees to the Netherlands, which is where a lot of the Puritans found safe haven during the time of Anglican persecution. He starts another community there, where he's safer to start a community. And Brown believed that local churches should be completely free of external influence. He believed that the church was safest, holiest, and most unified when it could govern itself autonomously, when nobody from outside was telling them what to do, when there really wasn't sort of some outside of the church external leadership of some kind. That's what he believed, and so that's what he did in the Netherlands. In an incredible turn of events, ironically, his new church community starts fighting and they fall apart in less than 2 years. Right? It kind of makes sense when you think about it. Even a church our size, when we have an issue we're going to talk about, and everybody gets a voice, it's just a recipe for dissension, isn't it? It's a recipe for arguing. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to resolve those things, but the more people get to talk, and the longer they get to talk, and if everybody holds equal authority, right, this kind of stuff is bound to happen. And so it happened very quickly in his church, which is just sad and ironic. And even more ironically, after that failed and blew up in his face in the Netherlands, he went back to England and he rejoined the established Anglican Church, and he stayed a priest in the Anglican Church until he died. So he separated and he tried his thing and it didn't work, and then he went back, and he was kind of a jerk the rest of his time. He died in prison for punching a constable when they tried to arrest him. So partly it's just that's the kind of guy that I guess you had to be a separatist. You kind of had to have that fire a little bit. But either way, it just didn't work like he thought it would. But his lasting impact on Congregationalism is that there were a number of people called Brownists, who were his followers, from the church in the Netherlands that ended up on the Mayflower in 1620. So even though his church didn't exactly thrive long term, it thrived long enough that some of his followers got on that boat that went to America in 1620 and landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and brought with them all of his congregational ideas. So one of the sources I found said this. I thought it was a helpful way to think about it. Brown is best thought of as a precursor rather than a founding father to later congregational churches. Okay, so that's what he did. He's kind of the first guy to try, and he obviously didn't succeed, and it's not this Luther success story of he did this and it went great and everything great happened after that. And nonetheless, his influence is important. Another early adopter of Congregationalism was a guy named Henry Barrow, who was a lawyer. He converted to Puritanism after hearing a powerful message. He quickly adopted the Brownist stance, which you could put Brownist/separationist. That's what they were. And he said, hey, we need to leave the Anglican Church. Again, this is not working. Quickly, he joined that branch. Barrow, along with three other guys named John Greenwood, Francis Johnson, and John Penry, formed their own separate church in 1592, so about 10 years after Robert Brown. And his stance was pretty much the same as Brown's, that in the church there should be no distinction between clergy, leaders, pastors, priests, whatever you want to call them, and laity, everyday people, church members. There should be no distinction between the two. We should all stand on completely equal status when it comes to authority and decision-making in the church. In 1593, again, this is not a long time between when they started it. Just a year later, probably less than a year later, Barrow was imprisoned and sentenced to death alongside John Greenwood. And before his death, he wrote all kinds of pamphlets and papers about the importance of separating from the Anglican Church and congregational principles. And even though their experiment didn't last long either, and they were martyred for their faith and what they believed, the ideology of Congregationalism lived on in his writings. Okay, and that's part of what kept it alive during this time period when everybody who seemed to adopt it was getting put to death pretty fast. Okay, so he is largely to credit along with these other three men. Okay, and then the last guy here that I want to look at is a guy named John Robinson. Several years after Brown and Barrow's early separatism, there was a young guy named John Robinson who was an Anglican priest from Cambridge, which was like the epicenter of congregational ideas. And he started wrestling with the Church of England's demanding conformity. He started wrestling with it internally, going, he was struggling with whether he should separate or not. He was struggling with whether or not it was right for the Church in England to demand conformity. And basically, he travels the country asking prominent Puritan leaders for advice. And a guy named John Smith actually convinces him that separatism is the right path to take. And then if Robinson, these are his words, he felt the call to separate as a burning fire shut up in my bones. John Smith was a persuasive guy, apparently, and he persuaded him that leaving was the right choice. And by the way, John Smith we'll talk about a lot in 2 weeks. He's considered the founder of the Baptist branch of Christianity. And it was him who convinced him to separate. And even though they agreed on many, 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 many things, they ended up founding different churches because of slightly different beliefs. John Robinson was threatened with imprisonment in 1607, so he and his church decided to try and flee England and go to the Netherlands like others had. But the captain that was supposed to smuggle them across the sea betrayed them, and they all got arrested and imprisoned. And then they got released, and then they tried again. And eventually they succeeded. They got to Amsterdam. They established a church there on congregational principles. And the ministry there was not easy, but it did grow. And again, Robinson's most dramatic impact is not that this church stayed there and lasted forever and grew and became a prominent denomination. It's that some people from his congregation also got on the Mayflower. Okay, so people with these congregational ideas kind of dominated the Mayflower. They dominated the earliest settlements in New England, which is part of why Congregationalism became incredibly significant in colonial America, particularly in New England. So as all these Puritans arrived, these congregational churches popped up and spread. And theologian pastors like John Cotton, you may have heard of John Cotton before. I think you talk about him even in history a little bit. He helped develop Congregationalism in New England. He provided stability and leadership to a group of churches that didn't want an established leader. They didn't want, stability and uniformity between all of their churches. They didn't want any of that. Cotton did that in a way that nobody else could. And so this group of churches that honestly, they squabbled a lot in their early history. A guy like John Cotton helped kind of stabilize things for a while during this period. And by 1740, 35%, I think, is the number of American churches were congregational. And they dominated the landscape of early colonial American Christianity, particularly in New England. New England was basically Episcopal churches and congregational churches. That's pretty much who was there. And another Congregational pastor / theologian you may recognize was a guy named Jonathan Edwards. Anybody heard of him? A significant American Christian in the 1700s. He played a huge role, maybe more than anybody else, in the First Great Awakening that sort of stirred America to faith during the 1700s. And he really helped. A guy like Edwards can really do a lot for a denomination, for a group of churches, and for an ideology, and he did that for Congregationalism. He preached a famous sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Anybody listen to that one? It'll shake you to your core. Even if read in like the original language, even more so, it will shake you to your core. And Edwards was a guy like that who did significant things for the Congregational branch in American colonialism. Other American Congregationalists played significant roles in different ways in the American Revolution, for instance, just like a lot of Episcopal Christians did. They also founded Harvard, Yale, and Dartmouth. Okay, these are schools founded on congregational principles. The reason that Yale and Harvard were founded was because they wanted to make sure there were good, educated, quality congregational pastors out there. Okay, that's why these schools find their beginning. And it's during this time that Congregationalism had a huge impact on American culture, American society, both then and for years to come. And even though not all, or even the majority of American churches were congregational in name, again, that idea of Congregationalism had become an inseparable part of American identity, that everybody gets a voice. Everybody gets a say. There should be no outside power telling us what to do and not do. That mentality, even in the churches, really was what sparked something that we come to know as the American Revolution, a democratic mindset where everybody gets a say. Taxation without representation, right? That shouldn't be a thing, Americans said. And a lot of that stems from congregational church polity. And so even though the origins of the branch of Christianity are kind of murky, the Robert Browns, the Henry Barrows, the John Robinsons, the John Cottons, the Jonathan Edwards, these are the guys that helped form and shape Congregationalism in early Christianity. So that's kind of where Congregationalism begins. It begins with those guys, Puritans separating from the Anglican Church and then eventually coming to America and things growing and growing and growing in America. That's where it begins. Well, between then and now, a lot has obviously happened because most of us have never seen a Congregational church or been to one. How do we get from 35% of American churches being that to where did they all go? Well, here's where they all went. Between American colonial Congregationalism and today, there has been just tons and tons and tons of upheaval and disagreement and divide. And again, it points back to what Robert Brown experienced in the Netherlands in the 1580s. If everybody gets a say and there's no unified leadership and no unified doctrine and every church gets to decide their own thing, is it really a surprise that there's a lot of argument? Is it really a surprise that these churches spend a whole lot of time squabbling? And despite tons of that early on, Congregational churches grew and spread during the 1700s. Again, guys like John Cotton, guys like Jonathan Edwards helped that happen. But after a stretch of vibrancy for these churches and strength, things went bad in the early 1800s. And that would kind of set the tone and set the pattern for until today. And the first big divide that they had occurred in the early 1800s over a divide about the Trinity. Okay. The divide had been brewing for years. There were a group called the Trinitarians and a group which you might know the name called the Unitarians. Okay, the Unitarians argued against the Trinity. They said the Trinity doesn't make sense. The Trinity is not scriptural. They argued a single view of a single person God. Okay, and again, there's a lot of different branches of that too. But anyway, that was a theological divide that had been brewing for years. And then a guy named Henry Ware was elected professor of theology at Harvard, which again was established by Congregational churches. And so when Unitarianism kind of rises to that level, things got worse. And then the divide grew even more in 1819 when a guy named William Channing preached another famous sermon, basically denouncing the Trinity and preaching Unitarian doctrine. And he convinced a lot of people. And eventually, between these two parties, sort of in the Congregational church, the Trinitarians and the Unitarians, they realized, this is one of those irreconcilable differences, right? Talking about the Trinity, this is one of those things that's not going to happen. We cannot remain united over this issue. And so the American Unitarian Association is founded in 1825, and the majority of Congregational churches adopt Unitarian theology. So here in 1825, the majority of Congregational churches in New England shift gears, denounce the Trinity, and join the Unitarian movement. So you want to know where Congregationalism lost its steam? Right there. Right there. When the majority said, yeah, the Trinity doesn't make sense. We're out. And then later on, because we're not really following the Unitarian branch, but later on in 1961, Unitarians merged with Universalists to form the Unitarian Universalist Church, which you'll see some of those around too. Again, not a huge player in the American Christian landscape, but fairly prevalent. There's one right down here. If you drive downtown Elgin, you'll pass one. It's a beautiful old building, and it's a Unitarian Universalist Church. You'll see one of those down there. So Unitarianism was kind of the first problem that split the Congregational church. The second problem was state disestablishment. Okay, Congregationalism was the state church in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Like, they were supported by state taxes. It was the church of the state. Unfortunately, between 1818 and 1820, all three of those states passed different legislation. The constitutional changes in Connecticut, New Hampshire's Toleration Act, and the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruling stripped Congregationalism of its special status as the state church. And the Massachusetts court ruling also ruled that when there was divide, for instance, between Unitarians and Trinitarians, they basically said the majority gets everything, and the minority gets nothing, and you're not a church anymore. So the majority of churches went the Unitarian route, which meant that Congregational churches lost property, they lost people, they lost resources, at the same time as of having lost their special status as the state church. So things went bad quickly with state disestablishment. And as that happened, Unitarianism grew and Congregationalism declined, right? Because they got all the money, they got all the property, and they had all the people. Okay, so that's the second thing. The third thing, the third major split, doesn't happen for quite a while. Congregational churches did a pretty good job of avoiding conflict for like 100 years. In 1865, they actually merged. These Congregational churches merged with another denomination to become the National Council of Congregational Churches in the United States, which will henceforth be referred to as the NCCCUS. And over the years, they merged with several smaller groups. So Congregationalism they started bringing people in. They weren't so much dividing, and they started bringing people in. Unfortunately, that didn't last. In 1931, the NCCCUS merged with the Christian Church, which you may have heard of, and formed a new denomination called Congregational Christian Churches. Unfortunately, division arose rapidly within this new merged denomination. They started arguing about things, primarily how much do we cooperate? Historical Congregational churches as these national committees and governing bodies and missions organizations that all the churches were working together in started to pop up. The Congregationalists said, whoa, we don't want to work with everybody. Like, we don't even want there to be a hint of like somebody's calling the shots for all of us. So they get upset about that. And in 1948, they split. And the NCCCUS splits, and the Conservative Congregational Christian Conference is established. And again, conservative is maybe a misleading word, not conservative theologically so much as polity-wise. They wanted to stay congregational in governance. Really, we'll talk about it at the end, but really all of these branches of the Congregational, they're fairly liberal as far as we would be concerned, doctrinally with most things. And then later, again, not that long later after that split, in 1957, the General Council of Congregational Churches merged with the Evangelical Reformed Church. And they formed this new branch of Christianity called the United Church of Christ. Anybody heard that one? There's a lot of those, right? There's a lot of those churches around. United Church of Christ. And while most congregations approved of this merger in 1957, not everybody did. And the ones who didn't either joined the Conservative Congregational Christians, or they later formed a new group called the National Association of Congregational Christian Churches. And through all these divides, the Congregational Church the landscape again has totally changed. It looks nothing like what it looked like in Jonathan Edwards' day, or in John Cotton's day, or in Robert Brown's day. It looks nothing like that anymore. The Congregational Church has a history marked by theological dispute and lack of central leadership. And as a result, there's just a ton of variety in congregational churches, which is why they split. It's why they kept merging. It's why they kept splitting. It's why they kept merging. It's why they kept splitting, because there was so much variance of opinion when it came to lots of key doctrinal issues and leadership issues. Okay, so the United Church of Christ is now the most prominent result of the congregational churches. So here's kind of who's left. Conservative congregational churches, you got 41,000 members, 285 congregations. A little bit bigger is the Congregational Christian churches, 70,000 members, 430 churches. So between those two branches that still bear that congregational name, you've got, a little more than 100,000 members and a little less than 700 churches, which is honestly not as many as there were in the 1700s. Okay, and then again, the two more prominent branches that sort of emerged from the congregational churches were the Unitarian/Unitarian Universalist. Again, they didn't join until 1961. But you've got over 200,000 members and over 1,000 churches of those in the United States. And then United Church of Christ, again, the most prominent branch that sort of came from the congregational branch, over 1 million members and over 5,000 churches. So a fairly prominent player in the American Christian landscape. Now, for the Episcopal Church, I had a really helpful breakdown of notable stances in the congregational churches. Well, the congregational churches, as we knew them early on, doesn't exist anymore. Okay, it just doesn't. There's a variety of denominations with a variety of stances on all doctrinal issues. I'm not joking. I tried to compile these four branches chart of kind of what the stances they hold. It's just not that easy. You know why? Because they argue. And they argue, and they argue, and there's no central leadership, and there's no central doctrine. Okay, the Unitarian Church has that now. The United Church of Christ has that now. But they've retained this sort of congregational mindset of, everybody can believe whatever they want. And like, for instance, some practice different forms of baptism than others. Some churches, the United Church of Christ doesn't demand baptism. They say, if you don't want to be baptized, that's fine. You don't have to be baptized. You don't have to be a church member to take the Lord's Supper. You don't have to be a church member to vote on things if you go there regularly, right? There's all kinds of things that as an SBC church we would say, I'm not in agreement with that. Okay, concerning baptism, the Lord's Supper, ordination, church polity, LGBTQ issues, church membership, really pretty much anything. Our church wouldn't see eye to eye on with pretty much any of these branches. A lot of them, some of the ones that are more theologically conservative, we would see eye to eye on with some major issues. But the United Church of Christ, the Unitarian churches, especially being kind of rooted in New England, have prided themselves throughout their history of being theologically liberal and socially liberal in ways that, again, we would not want that for our denomination, for our church. Okay, so again, sort of like Episcopal churches being rooted in New England, they've gone very theologically liberal from where they were founded way back in the Reformation. Okay, so it's really not easy to even say here's some notable stances across the board here. If you wanted like to know a specific branch, I could help point you in the right direction to know what those are, but it wasn't really even a possible thing to compile. So just real quick, 3 maps here. I want to show you kind of where these churches are rooted. So Congregationalist churches, again, basically the darker the color, the more densely populated it is. So again, these churches in like North Dakota and Montana, those big red spots, there's probably like 6 or 7 churches there, because there are just so few and there's so few people out there. But New England is where it was traditionally headquartered. Likewise with the United Church of Christ, significantly more prominent in the Midwest, Northeast. Okay, and then same really with Unitarians, which are very, very, very much concentrated in the Northeast. You'll see, a pretty high percentage near where we live, sort of Chicago, Illinois, Wisconsin, and then also the West Coast, okay, up near major cities. Those are kind of where they're headquartered for the most part. And just a helpful reminder at the end of this class every week as we break down different denominations, saying all Unitarians or all Universalists or all United Church of Christ members believe is a dangerous thing to say. It's a guaranteed overgeneralization. Okay? But at the same time, you can look at their denominational stances on things and say, this is what they say. Okay, so you have to be able to walk the line between saying, this is what the United Church of Christ believes as a denomination. This is the doctrine they've set down. But it's still dangerous to say all people who attend United Church of Christ churches believe this. So just want to kind of remind us that that's a guaranteed overgeneralization, and there is so much variance between the churches and between the members of those churches in doctrine, particularly of this of the congregational branch of Christianity. Okay, so same questions we're going to ask at the end of all these. What do you appreciate about the history of these denominations? What do you appreciate about what we talked about this morning, this church and their ideas?
I think it's kind of cool how it shows a lot of the correlation between even like American culture and politics with the church, especially at an early age. I mean, just that idea of we decide for ourselves what we want, and obviously that led to a lot of things within America. So it shows, in essence, like how God can use the church even in a much broader political, national standpoint too.
Oh yeah, they impacted culture. They impacted an entire society. And even though they don't really exist like that anymore, look at what they did. Look at the impact it had on American culture, on American society for centuries. Okay, yeah. And like I said, just even the idea of everybody should have a say. I mean, that's something we should have. Okay.
Since power was decentralized in these churches, I would imagine that there was probably not much corruption because power corrupts. So you don't hear about like in the Catholic Church or other.
Okay. Yeah. So they perhaps overcorrected to the point of there's no central leadership. And so a lot of the abuses that we've seen for the last 1,700 years of that establishment really aren't there. And that's what the Puritans wanted. They didn't want that anymore. They obviously led to other issues. And that's the next question, so don't go there yet. But yeah, that became a thing. Okay, good. What else?
I like one of the guys, I can't remember his name, but his kind of main reason for wanting to separate was because the church was demanding conformity, which we've already seen is not great. So I like that was another motivator. Like, hey, that's not biblical.
Yeah. Again, another branch of Reformation guys who said, no, we're not gonna do this anymore. We need to do our own thing, and they risked their lives. They really all did, and we've all benefited from that. Okay, what do you not appreciate about these denominations, about this branch of the Christian faith?
Doesn't sound like they're very theologically sound.
Okay. Yeah. Again, what do you expect, kind of? And they're okay with that. That's kind of their bread and butter. Is you can believe what you want to believe. That's what we're founded upon. Everybody gets a say. Everybody can think what they want to think.
Yeah, it seems like very acceptive of a lot of social issues that we would take stances on. They're like, sure, we can handle that.
Sure. Yeah. Again, very, very theologically and socially liberal, because that's their bread and butter. They're not going to apologize for it. Yeah. That's what they want. That's what they believe is right. But at the cost of doctrinal soundness. Yeah.
It's almost like they're taking reverse tense in that founding, they shaped the culture with their ideas. Now it's more almost the other way, the culture shaping what the church believes.
Okay.
Steering a lot of people in the wrong direction.
Yeah. That's certainly what we would say. Yeah.
I also think later on it seemed like they were more interested in keeping their name alive, just merging with any church that they could, and then realizing it just obviously wouldn't work. And I think that their values were in the wrong place.
Okay.
It seems like they started out like the intent, like they knew the Anglican Church, like something, isn't right here, and then they just took it to extreme. It's just like from one figurehead to nothing.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, their doctrine just became too diluted. There's too much compromise and conforming with non-doctrinal beliefs, and then so it's just got shattered.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we've been talking about for the last 13 weeks, isn't it? That you need to be able to walk that line between freedom, disagree over the things that we're okay to disagree on, and waver not whatsoever on the things that we can't. And the very fact that the big first split that happened in this church was over the Trinity, right, is like, that's a thing worth splitting over. What does studying this branch of Christianity, the history of the doctrine here, what does it cause you to reflect on or think more about?
leadership is not being held accountable. And sure, like there's like flaws in every church, but I think seeing this and seeing how it hasn't been successful in the past and how it's failed, it just shows like how important leadership is in the church and how it's meant to be stewarded well. Like I said, like churches struggle all the time with leadership, like we know that, but I think it causes me to think about like sure, like everyone can have a say, but that just leads to like disagreement, and leadership is really important.
Yeah, there's a reason that Paul writes what he writes, and Jesus taught what he taught, and a leaderless flock, a shepherdless flock, right? We know what happens to them, and that's kind of what happened. Okay. Other thoughts?
It would also make me really want to study the doctrine of any church that I went to. Like, I went to a Christian church before, go to a Baptist church now. Like, I feel like as long as it's a Christ-following Christian church, I would think they would all agree on, like, the essentials. But then, like, hearing that some of these churches, obviously not all the members, but maybe their doctrine doesn't, like, support the Trinity, it just blows my mind that would still be considered, like, Christian church.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, the churches that you went to are not ones you'd have to worry about when it comes to Trinitarian issues and things like that. But you're right that.
But you wouldn't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you that's part of the hope. That's one of the goals with this. We got to think about these things. We've got to be aware of these things. When we have conversations with either other believers or people who go to other churches, or if we go to other churches, these are things we need to know. These are things that if you go, really? You think, okay, I've heard of you in Unitarian churches. Like, yeah. But how, honestly, I was reading through it and I was talking to Alyssa yesterday and I was like, what about that remains Christian after the Trinity has been lost? Like that we even call them a denomination. Obviously, that's how I feel about it. That's not how they feel about it. But yeah, those things, those are things we need to know. Okay, other thoughts?
Well, I think that's when we first moved here and looking for churches, and you'd read, their website, and like here's what we believe, section. And you get to certain points, you're like, all right, nope.
Yeah, and likewise, we probably had Unitarians cruise our page and say, nope. Yeah, I mean, it's important to know what you believe. Okay, any other thoughts here?
Makes me wonder what would happen for the rest of the future if church leaders don't spend time together and if this congregationalist idea keeps going on and we all do our own thing and don't even chat or know what the other pastors and teachers are teaching, and then each will keep going their own way, and who knows where all those different branches will end up. Yeah,
we need each other. There needs to be some kind of agreed upon doctrine. There needs to be some kind of cooperation, and we're going to stray in all kinds of different directions. Okay, and by the way, within the branches that form, particularly the United Church of Christ, the majority of them have elders. The majority of them utilize their elders. Not all of them do. But in the United Church of Christ, when those couple of denominations came together, things changed a little bit. They're not called congregational for a reason. They became significantly less congregational. But yeah, there's a reason that the churches that retained that congregational idea went a different path. Okay, final reminder that, again, we're going to remind ourselves every week, do your best, Paul says in 2 Timothy 2, to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. Okay, when we think about every branch of Christianity, when we think about ourselves, this is the task for all of us, to do our best to present ourselves to the Lord as one approved, a worker with no need to be ashamed, having rightly handled the truth, rightly handled doctrine, rightly handled the word of God. And next week, we will talk about Methodist churches. And then the next week, we will talk about Baptist churches. And then the next week, we will talk about Baptist churches. And then the next week, we will talk about non-denominational churches. And then we will either wrap it up there, or what I might do is extend the class 2 weeks. And what I'd really like to do is talk about Calvary's history. I'm hoping to talk to we have several founding members of Calvary. And I'd really like to sit down with them and interview them and try and compile kind of a week like this that says who Calvary is and where we came from and why we exist and those kinds of things. Okay, so that's kind of where we're headed. Let me pray for us. Lord God, we thank you for this day that you've given to us. Thank you for your truth and your word. Thank you for allowing us freedom and variance as individuals with unique hearts and minds and thoughts and experiences. And Lord, we also thank you for your word that guides and directs and keeps us within the bounds of what you say is true. Help us to never leave that, to never abandon that, but Lord, also help us to disagree lovingly, disagree kindly, and not just rebuke and not necessarily condemn, but help try and correct and shape and lead in the way of truth. And Lord, I pray as we continue our study that you'd open our eyes to see what you want us to see. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.